So here's the real meat and potatoes, which is understanding the merge. And again, I would encourage everybody, feel free to ask questions throughout. If anything's not making sense, or if you'd like for me to dive a little bit deeper, don't be shy at all. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, so for the folks who just come in, or if you're particularly new, the thing that we're talking about is the merge for Ethereum. And if you did not know, that occurred approximately 17 hours ago, if I'm reading that correctly. Yeah, thereabouts. So it was like 1:15 this morning, where we finally moved from a proof of work system to a proof of stake system. I'm going to get into the details on that in a second, but high level, it's really equivalent to changing out the engine of a running car and switching it from a diesel engine to an electric motor. This is something fundamental to the power system of the whole unit. So let's get into it. So just to recap, blockchain basics, how are blocks formed? You have an order of transactions at the bottom here. Pay Sally 20 Bitcoin, pay Jimmy 5 Bitcoin, and this thing that's called the Coinbase transaction is, and pay me, in this case, 12.5 new Bitcoin for having mined the block, right? You take the entirety of that, hash it, and we just learned about hashing in the prior, right? And that's give it a unique signature so that we understand all the transactions are valid, and put that into the header, right? So that's an entire block. And if your block is approved, then you'll earn that Coinbase transaction. That's that reward for having solved the block, right? You link these things together by taking the prior header and take the hash of that and put it into your new block header. So that is prev block hash. It's that second item there. Prev block hash is a way of pointing to the block that came before. And that is the chain part of blockchain. So you have blocks, you have chain. The chain part of blockchain is and point at the block that came before. So let's talk a little bit about how these blocks are formed. At the basis, you have this thing called the mempool. And the mempool is a set of unorganized transactions. They're not finalized at all. At one point in time, it was Alex paid David to Ethereum. And before that transaction is finalized, it's just sitting in the mempool waiting to be processed. So for those of you who've had like credit cards and whatnot, you've probably had that thing where you see like pending transactions, same kind of idea, right? There's a bunch of different miners that are all taking transactions out of the mempool and organizing them into blocks, okay? And when they do so, in a proof of work system, only one of those miners' blocks is actually accepted as the new block. Everybody else's work gets thrown away. And this, in the Bitcoin system, that process happens every 10 minutes. In Ethereum, up until 1:15 this morning, that was happening every 13 seconds. And the thing is, though, it's not just 5 miners. It's a whole lot of miners. It's hundreds of thousands. So imagine you were doing this every 13 seconds. You're running this race, trying to organize transactions, create a SHA that had the right amount of leading zeros, and you're racing against everybody else, and oops, you didn't win, throw away your work, and try again with the next block. And again, and again, and again. This keeps on happening every 13 seconds. That's crazily wasteful. In fact, it's 99.95% wasteful, right? But in the early days of the cryptocurrency world, maybe it didn't matter so much because we could all actually run that software on our computers. There weren't a ton of people mining, and so the difficulty wasn't that bad. And so you didn't need to have super specialty hardware, right? Up until this morning, to actually mine a block, you needed hardware like this. This is a mining pool, and what they have are racks on racks on racks of these machines called ASICs. ASICs are very specialized computers. They don't have Facebook, they don't have Google. All that they do is they figure out how to find the leading number of zeros in that mathematical problem I was talking about before. And they use up a ton of energy, right? These mining pools very often are connected to some power source. So it was up until a year ago in China, you would see that they're hooked up to all the hydroelectric power systems. And China said, hey, that's kind of wasteful. We don't really want you to do that anymore. So that's why they're banning cryptocurrency mining. It's like, let's put that hydroelectric power to something useful, right? And so that's proof of work. You have to have this kind of ever-escalating system of hash rate and difficulty as you're trying to outcompete other people and solve blocks faster, right? But in a proof of work system, you also want those blocks to come out on a regular cadence. So if everybody's competing, you have to make the difficulty harder and harder and harder to keep those blocks coming out on time. Otherwise, they'd be solved too fast, all right? The problem with this is it caused a concentration of power in mining pools. And so mining pools are people who run a special kind of software that helps organize the miners. And some of them are inside of major warehouses like that. But even if you're just running a bunch of graphics cards out of your house, your chances are you're connecting to this software system that somebody else is using to organize your work with other people. And they're just giving you a range of nonces to try. Those numbers you use once, they're giving you like a range of nonces and that block of transactions. And you're just trying to see, are you the one that generates the right amount of zeros, right? So here we can see, Ethermine 28%, F2 Pool was my prior employer at 15%, Hivon 9.95%. It doesn't take too many of these to get over 50% of the networking power. And if you have over 50% of the networking power and you choose to collude with one another, you could actually rewrite the entire blockchain. So in proof of stake, who makes the blocks? Turns out everybody does, but in an orderly fashion. So what happens is you have validator number one organize out of the transactions out of the mempool, and they are selected, they solve the block. And then round robin, you choose the next miner. Miner number two, you select transactions out of the mempool and you solve the block, and so on and so forth. So all of that wastefulness that you saw before is gone. 99.95% gone. It's a major savings in electricity. What's up?
Question, you had pointed out about people potentially colluding with each other and like taking 50% of the blocks, 50% of the blocks.
Right.
And just changing the outcome. Is there like a difference between proof of stake and proof of work, and how does that help solve for that?
So the question was regarding this kind of 51% attack, and what's the difference in a proof of work world versus a proof of stake world? In a proof of work world, you have to work really, really hard, and it's really expensive to take over 51% of the network, right? In a proof of stake world, it is also really expensive, but it's the amount of money that you'd have to put down up front. So proof of stake means instead of me just showing up with a miner and mining blocks, I'm going to instead put down a certain amount of value and say, I intend to do good work. And if you catch me cheating or doing bad work, then I encourage you to take away some of that value I've put on the table. And what you get in trade for that is you get selected round robin to solve blocks. And so you only get chosen one at a time. To collude at the level of being able to rewrite blocks on the blockchain, you would have to put down enough value up front to run enough validators that you would then be able to like pick and choose how transactions are ordered inside of the block, but you'd only be able to do that for like one block, and then the next round robin occurs, and then you would have to hope that they selected you again. So like, case in point, let's say that you really don't like me and you don't want my transactions to succeed. So you are going to spend 51% of the stake. So in Ethereum, that's 32 ETH for all validators, right? And there's like 400,000 validators. So 200,001 times 32. If you have that much ETH laying around, first of all, congratulations. But you need a ton of ETH to run that many validators to be able to hopefully get chosen round robin enough that you could at least slow down my transactions, if not block them for an extended period of time. But even then, 51%, you're not going to get 100%. And at some point in time, one of these other kind-hearted validators who does not have a grudge against me is going to process my transaction, right? So you really don't have that same kind of problem in a proof-of-stake system in general. So David asked a really interesting question. If you're pseudonymous, because we were just talked about that in the Web3 presentation, how would anybody know who anybody is? There are plenty of ways that people kind of give away their information without really intending it, or sometimes really intending it. Case in point in Twitter, super popular for NFT projects to be like, hey, would you like a free NFT? Drop your address in here, and we're going to airdrop you something. And so now you have this address that's identified with your Twitter account, which is like part of your personality, right? That would be one idea, right? Another one might be that somebody's just been watching your on-chain activity, and they just don't like the fact that you're a mega NFT trader or a major DeFi trader, and that would be like another point of attack, right? Yeah.
So you don't always know
Yeah.
exactly who you are. You can make some guesses about what you're doing, or if you've connected other information haphazardly.
So they don't know what you. So today, what David's saying is sometimes, yeah, people don't know exactly who you are, but maybe they could infer it based on blockchain and activity for sure. Yeah. So if we're moving on here, the the new idea here is who can make the blocks, right? And the truth is that it's instead of it being those warehouses full of really specialty hardware, it turns out it can be just about anybody. And by just about anybody, I mean really just about anybody. These are a whole bunch of different staking from home rigs that people have. And this guy made a whole song about it. It's really adorable. I'm not going to try and play it over the microphone. I'll encourage you to find this later. But these are all like little machines. Most of them are Intel NUCs. An Intel NUC is something that looks like an Apple TV, and it's about as powerful, that is able to run a validator and solve blocks. This is a major thing that's changed, is that when you put down that staked amount and you promise to do good work, you don't actually need that many zeros at the beginning of your hash to do good work, because you're not competing with other people to solve blocks in a certain time.
So if we're doing something like this, say I want to become a validator, do I have to have some kind of knowledge or some kind of technical ability to do that, or can I just easily go online and sign up for something and take part in that? How do I gain value?
So the question is, if you want to become a validator, how do you go about doing that? And there is a little bit of specialty knowledge, but the trick is that it's also open and free and available for everybody to check out. I'd highly recommend for people to go look at ETH Staker. And maybe even, whoops. Goodness gracious. I just like that song way too much. Yeah, I think that you could look at the ETH Staker community. They would be the right people to talk to. And I maybe have a link to that. So yeah, in terms of energy usage, right, you have YouTube, you have gold mining, Bitcoin proof of work, Ethereum proof of work up until like 110, 112 this morning, right? Netflix, gaming, PayPal, and now Ethereum proof of stake. It's even less than PayPal. That's because it's using way less energy in terms of its wastefulness, right? These are just one machine at one time solving these blocks, rather than thousands upon thousands of machines all running and throwing away their electricity every 13 seconds, right? So yeah, just to talk about issuance for a second, one of the major things that's also changing with the merge is how Ethereum is doled out. So earlier we were talking about this idea of the Coinbase transaction. If you're a miner, you solve the block, you get the Coinbase transaction, which for Ethereum was 2 ETH per block. That's actually changing now, right? And what's really sad about it in the proof of work world is, you would get 2 ETH, but everybody else would get nothing. You all still have to pay your electricity bills nonetheless. And that 2 ETH, you have to convert it back to cash so that you can pay that electricity bill. So for Ethereum, in terms of like basic price action, supply and demand, you're constantly having this sell pressure on Ethereum so that the miners could actually pay their bills, right? And then just keep whatever little bit is left over. In the new proof of stake system, you don't get as much Ethereum, but you also don't get that big electricity bill. So you don't have that much sell pressure on Ethereum in the first place. And there was this thing that came out last year. It's called EIP 1559. What happens in the past, it used to be the fees and the block reward. This was the Coinbase transaction, would go to the miner. What happens now is that the base fee that goes to operating the network actually gets burned. And so that means that the amount of Ethereum is going to decrease over time. And there, for a good number of blocks, what's going to happen is the net issuance is actually going to be negative, which means that Ethereum becomes deflationary rather than inflationary as an asset. For those of you who are really into finance, that might be a useful term. I might need to break it down. What's up, David?
I'm just wondering if there's a bunch of people that are a little bit upset with warehouses holding back some servers right now. They don't need them.
So David's asking a very practical question. What about the miners? What happened to all that hardware, right? I'd encourage you to look on eBay.
Are you saying processors just got cheaper?
Not only did the ASICs, right, the ASICs market is going to open up because a bunch of miners will close up shop if they don't go to another blockchain. There are plenty of other blockchains that use like SHA-256, and so you can reorient them toward that. For the people that had the GPU-based mining rigs, there are wholly alternative systems that they could put themselves towards. So there's the render token. There are these other things that they use GPUs and rent out that power. And you could do that, or you just put them out on the market. If you look at eBay right now, the video game graphics card market is like just like bottoming out, which is beautiful for those of us who are trying to make that new gaming rig at a cheaper price. Yeah. So yeah, here I was just kind of breaking it down. Like this is from a website called Watch the Burn, and they were kind of showing that since EIP 1559 was launched, the net reduction in overall Ethereum generated was 48%, and that's pre-merge. Yeah.
What is EIP 1559? Sounds like
Yeah, that EIP 1559 was exactly changing the fee structure. So instead of all the fees going to the miners, what happens is the base fee, which is for network operations, gets burned. That's the fundamental difference. Yeah. So proof of stake for Ethereum post-merge is now ultrasound money, right? We get accumulating rewards because people don't need to sell them off, right? Reduced sell pressure. Miners don't need to recap on that electricity cost. And you can have negative net issuance with EIP 1559. It doesn't happen every single block, but it does happen enough. And I'd highly encourage you to check out ultrasound.money and see how that how that works. So to recap, the network has moved to proof of stake. It uses 32 Ethereum to run a validator. That's what you have to put down as your stake if you want to start solving blocks on the Ethereum network. That's not cheap, right? That's roughly, what, $1,500 times 32? That's like a car worth of Ethereum for a nice car, a really nice car. Not everybody has that laying around, but it's also a 99.95% reduction in the energy used, and I can't state that enough, that the proof of work system is, in general, wasteful. It's on purpose. It's part of its security model, but we don't all have to do that for every single blockchain. We can choose to use systems like proof of stake that use way less energy, right? And then possible negative issuance depending on the amount of transaction fees and whatnot. So yeah. Any questions?
So originally you had said it took like 13 seconds to figure out.
Right.
Now with this new proof of stake, and it's only going to one person at a time, do we know the timing?
So Michelle just asked a great question, which was previously in proof of work, you would get a block approximately every 13 seconds or so. But now that it's proof of stake and we know who's going to mine the next block, is there anything else that changes? And it's a super good question. Yes. What happened is because you have the lower difficulty, you tend to have a much more stable release of blocks that happen on every 12 seconds. and so you can almost set your watch to it. There was a graph I was checking out this morning on Twitter that was showing the timestamps for each of the blocks. If we go way back to the beginning of the presentation, you would see inside of the block header there's a timestamp. When you measure the difference between those in a proof of work world, that timestamp difference, it just jumps all over the place because it's trying to average toward 13 seconds, right? So you'll get a few above, a few below as the difficulty keeps on shifting. And post, it was really flat. There was only like one attestation that got missed, but otherwise, like, it was just flat, which is amazing. Yeah, you can just about set your watch to it. But excellent question. When does scaling happen? Oh, what a good question. So that's in my appendix. So there are other things to point out, like that, yes, centralization is still a problem. Staking pools can be a source of that. But talking about what's coming next, yes, there's this Ethereum roadmap. And the merge, of course, was like the big thing. And there's still a little bit more to be dealt with. Withdrawing is not a thing for the people that have staked. And that means that value is locked. And we can talk more about that in a second. But in terms of scaling, there is sharding that's going to happen with the surge. There is also the splurge, where there's proposer versus builder separation. Those things are the two key factors, I think, in terms of scaling. So sharding is the ability to split out the work across multiple, effectively, subchains. And proposer-builder separation is not just about throughput, but it's also about fairness. So it's about who gets to order the blocks versus who proposes the blocks. And that got back to that earlier problem when I was talking about what would happen if Petros didn't like me so much and wanted to try and like block my transactions. How can you make a system more fair by default? If you separate who proposes the transactions or who proposes the blocks versus who builds the transactions inside of those blocks, you get toward a more fair system in general. Yeah, but great question. So it's coming. Any other questions? Alrighty. Well, hey, if anything else comes up, thank you, and definitely feel free to catch me and ask questions later.